There are more than 70 warships in the United States Navy today that carry the same man's name. Every ocean on Earth has at least one of them on patrol at this moment. No fleet of any nation in any century has ever carried so many ships under a single name. That name is Arleigh Burke. And on the night of Thanksgiving, 1943, off a small headland in the South Pacific that most Americans have never heard of, he did something no other American naval commander, before or since, has ever done in a night surface action. This is the story of that night, and of the man almost no one remembers. The night has no moon. Somewhere in the Solomon Sea, between the volcanic island of Buka and the long dark spine of New Ireland, the water sits black and flat, no wind, no stars. The kind of darkness sailors had learned to mistrust by 1943, because for most of the war the Japanese had owned the darkness. 5 American destroyers moved through it without lights. No radios, no talk on the bridge above a murmur, just the soft rush of hulls cutting water at 31 knots. In the chart house of the lead ship, the USS Charles Osborne, a green ring sweeps across a radar screen. A man bends close to it. He is 42 years old. Stocky, thinning at the temples, he smokes a pipe even now, even here, the smoke catching the dim red light of the compartment. His eyes are the eyes of a man who has waited a very long time for one specific moment. A signalman whispers a distance, 22,000 yards, then another, closer. The man at the screen does not look up. He raises one finger, then he speaks. 2 words, fire torpedoes. Somewhere behind him, in the dark, 15 Mark 15 torpedoes drop into the sea and begin to swim. They are aimed at men who do not yet know they are being aimed at. In 4 minutes, the lead Japanese destroyer Onami will explode and disappear, taking her captain and every man aboard with her. This will be remembered by the United States Navy as one of the most perfectly executed surface actions in its history. It will be studied at the Naval War College for the next 80 years, and the man with the pipe, the one who built it, plan after plan, on scraps of paper in the heat of Espiritu Santo, will become one of the most decorated officers his country ever produced. But almost no one will remember his name. 42 years before that black night, on the dry brown plains east of Boulder, Colorado, a Swedish immigrant's wife gave birth to her first son. It was the 19th of October, 1901. The Fook farm had no electricity, no telephone. The mountains stood blue and far to the west. The boy was named Arleigh Albert. He grew up milking cows before sunrise, riding broken horses, fixing the same machinery his father fixed and his father's father had fixed. He was not remarkable. His teachers remembered him as quiet, methodical, slow to anger and slower to forgive. The family had no money for college, none. So when a state senator passed through Boulder in 1919, looking for boys to send to a federal academy that cost nothing to attend, Arleigh Burke raised his hand. He took the train to Annapolis in the summer of his 19th year. He had never seen the ocean. The United States Naval Academy in 1919 was a place that broke farm boys. Burke did not break. He did not shine either. He graduated 4 years later, in the middle of a class of more than 400, forever the middle. He married a girl named Roberta Gorsuch that same summer. Friends called her Bobby. She was small, sharp-eyed, and 22 years old. She would follow him across 2 oceans and 42 years of naval service. They would never have children. In his first year as an ensign, Arleigh Burke was assigned to the battleship USS Arizona. He walked her decks. He memorized her guns. He could not have known then that the same ship would burn at her moorings in 18 years, while he himself would be 6,000 miles away, behind a desk, watching the world he had trained for catch fire without him. For 2 decades, Arleigh Burke went nowhere. He moved, he worked, he rose, slowly, from Arizona to other ships, then ashore to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, where the United States Navy stored its experts on bullets, shells, and fuses. Burke became one of them. He learned every type of naval gunnery round in service. He could draw the cross-section of a 5-inch projectile from memory. He spoke a little Japanese, picked up during a tour in Asia in the early 30s. None of it earned him a command at sea. Bobby followed him from port to port. She kept a habit. As soon as she saw where her husband's ship was docked, she would walk inland, find the first acceptable room they could afford, and rent it. They lived in narrow apartments. They did not save. They did not complain. By the autumn of 1941, Arleigh Burke was 40 years old and still ashore, a staff officer, a specialist, a man whose name appeared on memoranda about powder bags and propellant testing. On the morning of December 7th, he was at home in Washington when the news from Pearl Harbor came over the radio. The USS Arizona, the ship of his first commission, burned in the harbor with 1,177 men trapped inside her. Burke went to work the next day. To his desk, to his powder bags, he requested transfer to combat. The request was denied. His expertise in ordnance, the Navy said, was too valuable to risk in the Pacific. He requested again, denied. He kept requesting every few months for more than a year. The answer did not change. Months passed, then a year. Burke watched from a window in Washington as classmates of his sailed for the Solomons and the Coral Sea and Midway. Some of them did not come back. It was the spring of 1943 before the Navy finally let him go. 20 years of training, 15 months of war, and Arleigh Burke had still not fired a shot in anger. He was 41 years old when he stepped off a transport plane at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides into the heat and the rotting smell of the South Pacific. He had 18 months to make his name. He would need only 7. The war he stepped into was not the war the newspapers described. Back in Washington, the radio said the Pacific was being won. Midway, Guadalcanal, the tide had turned, but there was a stretch of water, narrow and deep, between the islands of Savo and Florida and Guadalcanal that the men who sailed it had begun to call Iron Bottom Sound. They called it that because of what lay on the floor. In August of 1942, off Savo Island, a Japanese cruiser force led by Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa fell on an Allied screen in the dark. The battle lasted 32 minutes. 4 Allied heavy cruisers went to the bottom. More than 1,000 sailors died. It would later be called the worst defeat the United States Navy had ever taken in a stand-up fight. In October, again at night, at a place called Cape Esperance, the cruiser USS Boise took an 8-inch shell in her forward magazine. She survived. 107 of her men did not. In November off Tassafaronga, 8 Japanese destroyers under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka turned in the darkness and fired long-lance torpedoes at an American cruiser force. The Americans had radar. The Japanese did not. The Americans still lost. 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 3 more crippled, nearly 400 American sailors dead in minutes. Tanaka lost 1 destroyer. The pattern repeated. Every time the United States Navy went into Iron Bottom Sound after sunset, the Japanese killed more Americans than the Americans killed Japanese. Sometimes by a margin of 5 to 1. Sometimes worse. The reason, the survivors said, was simple. The Japanese could see in the dark. They had trained for it for 20 years. They had night vision optics, perfect torpedoes, perfect doctrine, perfect discipline. American destroyer captains were taught to stay close to the cruisers and protect them. The Japanese destroyer captains were taught to attack first. The Tokyo Express, the nickname the Americans gave to the nightly Japanese runs down the channel between New Georgia and Choiseul, ran almost without challenge for months. Reinforcements reached Japanese garrisons. Wounded men were taken out. American Marines on the islands looked up at the ocean and saw an enemy who came and went at will. Somewhere in Washington, in those same months, Arleigh Burke had been inspecting fuse mechanisms. When he finally landed at Espiritu Santo, this was the inheritance, a war his navy was losing in the dark. He spent his first weeks watching. He went aboard destroyers. He read action reports. He found the gunnery officers and the radar operators and asked them what had gone wrong and what had gone right and what they would do differently if they were allowed. The Navy gave him a small command, Destroyer Division 43, then a larger one, Destroyer Division 44. He took both into combat. Neither distinguished itself in any way the public would have noticed. But Burke was watching and writing and thinking. He noticed that American radar, the new SG sets being installed on the Fletcher-class destroyers, could see Japanese ships before Japanese lookouts could see anything at all. The advantage was not by yards, it was by miles. He noticed that American doctrine wasted the advantage. Destroyers were tethered to cruisers. They were ordered to fire only when the cruisers fired. By the time anyone fired, the Japanese had already launched torpedoes from beyond visual range. He noticed that his own torpedoes, the Mark V, were not the equal of the Japanese long lance, but they were good enough if you fired them first and from close enough. He started writing memoranda, notes, tactical instructions to his captains: cut the destroyers loose, trust the radar, shoot the torpedoes first, the guns second, close fast and turn away fast. Do not wait for permission. On the 23rd of October 1943, Captain Arleigh Burke was given command of Destroyer Squadron 23, 8 Fletcher-class destroyers in 2 divisions of 4. Destroyer Division 45 was Charles Osborne, Dyson, Stanley and Claxton. Destroyer Division 46 was Spence, Thatcher, Converse and Foote. Burke moved his flag to Charles Osborne. He named the squadron the Little Beavers after a small Indian boy in a comic strip his sailors were reading at the time. They painted the figure on the bridge. They were proud of it. He gathered his 8 captains in a wardroom at Tulagi. He laid his ideas in front of them. They did not have to agree, he told them. He also told them that if they sailed with him, this was how they would sail. None of them argued. And then, in the last week of October, the orders came down from Admiral William Halsey himself. The Marines were going to land on the island of Bougainville. Burke would screen the landing. There was just one problem. The Fletcher-class destroyers were rated at 37 knots. On paper, new, freshly maintained, with hulls scraped clean. Burke's 8 ships were not new. They had been at sea on continuous patrol for months. Their hulls were fouled, their boiler tubes were scaled. The strongest of them could make 34 knots if pressed. The slowest could not exceed 30. Burke begged Halsey for time, a week in port, 3 days even to clean the hulls and tune the boilers. He was told no. The Marines were landing. There was no time. So when Captain Arleigh Burke radioed his readiness reports to Fleet Command in the last days of October 1943, every one of them began with the same 4 words. Proceeding at 30 knots, it was not a description, it was a complaint sent over and over every day into the void of higher command. Halsey did not answer. Not yet. The Solomon Islands lie in a chain that runs southeast from the equator like a row of bad teeth. By the autumn of 1943, every name on that chain had become a graveyard. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, New Georgia, Vella La Vella. The Marines had taken them one at a time, paying for each island in blood, malaria and time. Bougainville was the next island in the chain. It was also the last. Take Bougainville, and the American air war could finally reach Rabaul, the great Japanese fortress at the northern tip of New Britain, the place from which every Japanese ship and every Japanese plane in the South Pacific was supplied. Take Bougainville, and the Southern Solomons campaign was effectively over. The 1st of November 1943, just before dawn, the 3rd Marine Division began landing at Cape Torokina on the western coast of Bougainville. Higgins boats grinding into a beach lined with mangrove and dark green jungle. Japanese shore batteries opened up from positions inland. The Marines pushed forward. Out at sea, screening the landing, were 3 task forces of American warships under the overall command of Rear Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson. One of them, Task Force 39, was a covering force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Aaron Stanton Merrill, 53 years old, a Mississippian from Natchez. A man who spoke softly and was generally underestimated. Inside Task Force 39, Merrill had attached the destroyer division Burke commanded directly: Charles Osborne, Dyson, Stanley, Claxton. Burke's flag was on Osborne. The Japanese in Rabaul were not slow to react. At the headquarters of the 8th Fleet, Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin reportedly told his sailors that if Bougainville fell, Japan herself would topple. It was perhaps an overstatement. It was perhaps not. By the afternoon of November 1st, a Japanese striking force was already standing out of Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. 2 heavy cruisers, the Myoko and the Haguro, 8-inch guns and armor belts. 2 light cruisers, the Sendai and the Agano. 6 destroyers, including the Shiga, the Samidare, the Shitsuyu, the Hatsukaze, the Naganami, and the Wakatsuki. The force was commanded by Vice Admiral Sentaro Omori. He was 52 years old. He had been a naval officer since the Empire of Japan was still figuring out what kind of empire it was. His orders were to find the American landing force and destroy it before sunrise. He came south through the rain. The night of the 1st to the 2nd of November 1943, the rain came down in sheets. Empress Augusta Bay lay west of Bougainville, an open stretch of water marked on Japanese charts only by depth lines and the faint outline of the island behind it. Merrill's task force was deployed there in 2 columns, 4 light cruisers in the center, Montpelier, Cleveland, Columbia, Denver, 4 destroyers ahead of them under Burke, 4 destroyers astern under Commander Bernard L. Austin. The American doctrine, as Burke had spent 6 months arguing it should be changed, required the destroyers to remain close to the cruisers, to shoot when the cruisers shot. Merrill, in a decision that would matter more than he probably knew at the time, gave Burke permission to do something else, something Burke had been writing memoranda about for half a year. If Burke made radar contact with Japanese ships first, he could break off from the cruiser column and attack independently, with torpedoes, before the cruisers fired a single gun. It was Burke's doctrine in the field for the first time. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, American radar found the Japanese. Burke's 4 destroyers turned hard to port and began their run. Their orders, his orders, were clear, close to within 5,000 yards. Launch torpedoes, turn away. Do not announce yourself until the torpedoes are in the water. The 4 destroyers picked up speed. Burke on the bridge of Osborne, pipe gone now, jaw tight, the captain of each destroyer counting down the range to fire. At 2:30 in the morning, Charles Osborne, Dyson, Stanley and Claxton fired their starboard torpedo mounts. 25 Mark 15 torpedoes hit the water. They turned away in unison and ran. In the chart house, Burke watched the seconds. He watched his stopwatch. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Each torpedo was nearly 2 tons of steel and explosive, moving at 45 knots, traveling toward the Japanese line at a closing speed that could not be evaded if the calculations were right. The calculations were not right. Not one of the 25 of torpedoes hit a Japanese ship. Not one. The Japanese had turned, the range had been wrong, the lead angle had been wrong. The estimate of Japanese speed had been wrong. The torpedoes ran past the Japanese column and exploded harmlessly against the empty sea. It was the first full application of the doctrine Arleigh Burke had been begging the Navy to adopt. 25 torpedoes, 0 hits. In any earlier age of the war, this would have ended a career. What saved Burke was not Burke, it was Merrill in the cruisers behind him. Merrill had radar of his own. He had 4 light cruisers with 12 6-inch guns each. He understood, in the moments after Burke's torpedoes failed, that the Japanese were now committed, in the open, exposed, expecting nothing. He opened fire with 48 6-inch guns at 20,000 yards. The Sendai, the Japanese light cruiser leading the column, took a direct salvo and began to burn. She did not sink for several hours, but she was finished from the first minute. The destroyer Hatsukaze, attempting to maneuver out of the way, collided with the cruiser Miyoko. Hatsukaze was torn open along her side. She would sink before sunrise. Omori on his flagship Haguro tried to bring his 8-inch guns to bear. The American maneuver kept the range outside Japanese visual contact. Omori's gunners aimed at gun flashes, at radio direction, at guesses. Their shells fell short, or wide, or both. Some splashed within yards of Cleveland and Montpelier. None hit anything that mattered. The Japanese withdrew at 4 in the morning. They left Sendai burning, Hatsukaze sinking, and their illusions about the night beginning, finally, to crack. The Americans had won. The Americans had not won with Burke's torpedoes. In the after-action report Burke wrote himself, a few days later, he did not soften the failure. He recorded every torpedo. He recorded the firing solution. He recorded the miss. He recommended that the doctrine continue. He recommended that the targeting data be revised. He did not, in any document that survived, blame anyone but himself. In the after-action reports filed by the Japanese, the same battle reads like a different battle. One of those reports was filed by the captain of the destroyer Shiga. His name was Tamichi Hara. He was 43 years old, born in 1900 in the small port city of Takamatsu on the inland sea. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1922, 1 year before Arleigh Burke graduated from Annapolis. The 2 men had spent 20 years training to fight each other across the same ocean. Hara was a torpedo specialist. He had helped write the doctrine the Japanese destroyer force used at night. Long Lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled 24-inch warheads, a range of nearly 20 miles at low speed. He believed in 1942 that the Japanese destroyer force was the finest in the world. He had reason to believe it. They had spent the first year of the war proving it. At Empress Augusta Bay, Hara had Shigure in the screening line behind Omori's heavy cruisers. He wrote, years later, in a memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain, what he remembered of that night: the rain, the flash of American shellfire on the horizon. The chaos in his radio when Sendai began to burn, and the sudden, sickening realization, somewhere in the first minutes, that something was wrong, that the Americans had fired without warning, that his lookouts had seen nothing before the first shells fell. In the middle of the battle, with no visible target, Hara ordered his crew to fire torpedoes back into the dark. 8 long lances dropped into the water. They ran into nothing. He turned Shiga hard, he maneuvered, he survived, he brought his ship home to Rabaul. But somewhere in the long hours of that night, Hara had understood something he could not unlearn. The Americans had seen him before he had seen them. They had not been better sailors. He had been to sea with American officers before the war. He knew their captains were competent. He also knew, in his bones, that Japanese officers were trained for the night and American officers were not. That was no longer enough. The Americans had a machine now that gave them eyes in the dark. A machine the Japanese did not have, a machine no amount of training could match. This is the truth that does not appear in American histories of the battle. The Japanese were not beaten by better sailors at Empress Augusta Bay. They were beaten by radar. In the 3 weeks that followed, the rules of the South Pacific changed. Burke took Destroyer Squadron 23 back to the channel between Bougainville and the larger islands to the south. The narrow stretch of water the Americans called the Slot. It was where the Tokyo Express had run, almost untouched, for more than a year. Every night Japanese destroyers had carried troops and supplies south, and ammunition and wounded back north. Now it was Burke's water. The Little Beavers patrolled it in pairs and in fours. They worked sectors at flank speed. They drilled every night on what to do when the radar picked up a contact, the immediate turn, the silent approach, the torpedo launch, the breakaway. Burke had typed his tactical instructions on a stack of carbon paper and distributed copies to every destroyer captain. The captains carried them folded in the breast pockets of their khaki shirts. When American transports moved up the Slot, Burke radioed ahead with the same blunt warning every time: "Stand aside. Stand aside. I'm coming through." He came through at 30 knots. In those weeks, the Little Beavers engaged Japanese forces more times than any American destroyer squadron had ever engaged Japanese forces in a comparable period. Skirmishes, night intercepts, a barge convoy off Buka, a small Japanese escort destroyer near the island of Choiseul. The men of Destroyer Squadron 23 began a tradition. On the bridge of each destroyer, above the wheel, the bosun's mates painted a small symbol every time the squadron sank a Japanese ship. The symbols were not crossed flags, they were not anchors, they were tiny grass huts on stilts, tropical privies, latrines. It was a joke from earlier in the year, when the squadron had once run so close to a Japanese-held shoreline at flank speed that the wake had knocked over outhouses along the water's edge. The image had stuck. Now every kill was an outhouse. By the 3rd week of November 1943, the bridge of the USS Charles Osborne carried 8 outhouses painted in white on her grey steel. 8 in 3 weeks. Burke did not stop. He pressed his ships harder. He let them maintain almost nothing. He kept them on patrol day after day until their boilers wheezed and their hulls fouled with weed. And one night, on the boiler deck of the USS Spence, a sailor whose name has not survived found something jammed in the steam line that no one would have believed if they had not seen it for themselves. The USS Spence was the slowest ship in the squadron. She had been at sea longer than the others. Her hull had been scraped by coral. Her boilers had been pressed past their design tolerances for weeks. By the night of November 23rd, the chief engineer of Spence was reporting to Burke that the destroyer could no longer maintain station at squadron speed. Below decks, in the boiler room, the engineer ordered a full inspection of the steam tubes. Inside one of them, fouling the steam flow, a sailor found a toothbrush. It is not entirely clear, even now, how the toothbrush had gotten there. Some of the men later guessed it had fallen in during cleaning. Some thought it had been dropped accidentally by a fireman months earlier. The engineer did not waste time speculating. He had no spare boiler tube to replace the fouled one. He had no time to call for one from Espiritu Santo. He did what destroyer engineers did in 1943. He jury-rigged a bypass. A length of copper tubing run around the block tube restored steam flow. Spence picked up 1 knot. When Burke received the report the next morning, he understood, with the dry humour of a man who had been complaining for 6 months, that the squadron's maximum sustained speed had now climbed from 30 knots to 31. It was an absurd improvement, a single knot, from a single toothbrush. After 6 months of his men begging for proper maintenance time, this is what the South Pacific had given him. He sent a routine readiness report to Fleet Headquarters that afternoon. He composed it himself, proceeding at 31 knots. It was almost certainly intended as a joke. A small, dry in-house joke aimed at Halsey, who Burke knew was reading every report. What came back from Halsey was not a joke. It came in the form of a flash priority message transmitted that same evening. 31 knot Burke, get Wubuka Rabble evacuation line. If enemy contacted, you know what to do. A nickname had been born in Fleet Headquarters, written in capital letters in a transmission room at Noumea, almost by accident. Within 48 hours, the wire services would have it. Within a week, every newspaper in the United States would be running the phrase. Within a month, 31 knot Burke would be part of the public language of the Pacific War. The truth was the toothbrush. Arleigh Burke never corrected the story. He never told the wire services about the toothbrush. He never explained, until decades later, that he had been moving at 31 knots because the toothbrush had given him back his last knot of speed. Halsey's message went on after the new nickname. The phrase was Halsey at his clearest. No diagrams, no commentary. A standing order Burke could execute without further consultation. The intelligence behind the order came from American codebreakers in Hawaii. Through the late summer and autumn of 1943, the United States Navy had been reading Japanese radio traffic, not perfectly, not in real time, but often enough and well enough to know that on the night of November 24th, a Japanese force would attempt to evacuate Japanese troops from the small island of Buka, just north of Bougainville. Buka had become untenable. American air attacks were grinding the small Japanese garrison there into ruin. Tokyo had decided to pull the survivors out. The evacuation force, the Americans knew, would consist of 5 Japanese destroyers. 3 of them would carry the soldiers, 2 of them would escort. The escorts were Onami and Makinami. The transports were Amagiri, Yugiri, and Uzuki. In overall command of the force was Captain Kyoto Kagawa. He was approximately 50 years old. He had entered the Imperial Japanese Navy as a cadet in 1917. He had served in destroyers, in cruisers, on the staff of the combined fleet. He had been promoted to captain in 1942 and had taken command of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron in 1943. He was, by every measure, a professional. He was also, by November of 1943, a man running an evacuation in waters he no longer controlled. His orders were to make landfall at Buka after dark on the 24th, load the troops in less than 2 hours, and be back at sea before midnight. He would then run northwest at flank speed toward Rabaul, behind the cover of the New Ireland coastline. The route would take him past a point of land called Cape St. George. On the American side, Burke received Halsey's flash message at fueling rendezvous off the coast of New Georgia with 5 of his 8 destroyers on station. The other 3 were elsewhere on independent missions. Burke would take what he had. The 5 destroyers were Charles Osborne, his flagship, Claxton, Dyson, Converse, Spence. Burke ordered the formation to top off fuel and weigh anchor. It was the afternoon of November 24th. He had less than 10 hours to get his destroyers into position. The 5 American destroyers ran north at 31 knots. The sea was black, the sky overcast. A low ceiling of cloud trapped what little light there was on the water and gave back none of it. Burke stood on the open wing of the bridge of the Charles Osborne, pipe-lit, eyes on the radar repeater set into the bulkhead in front of him. He had organized his 5 destroyers into 2 divisions for this approach. The first division, his own, was Charles Osborne, Dyson, and Claxton. They would lead. They would be the attack element. The 2nd Division, 4,000 yards behind on the starboard quarter, was Converse and Spence under Commander Bernard Austin. They were the reserve. Their job when the time came was simple: be in position to finish whatever the 1st Division crippled. Radio silence was absolute. No transmissions, no depth-finding pings, even hand-signaled flags between ships were avoided. The Little Beavers were a black formation moving across black water. Inside the chart house of every destroyer, the same calculations were being made and remade. Time to Cape St. George, speed of advance, expected position of the Japanese force. Burke had assumed the Japanese would steam at 26 knots and would pass Cape St. George at approximately 1:40 in the morning. He had positioned his squadron to intercept that exact spot at that exact minute. The math was tight. If the Japanese were faster than expected, Burke would arrive late. If they were slower, he would arrive early and might be sighted. In the dark, every man on the Osborne who could be at his battle station was at his battle station. Torpedo-men on the deck above, gunners at the 5-inch mounts, lookouts in the bridge wings. The chief radar operator, a young petty officer, sat in front of the SG screen with his face inches from the glass. Burke himself did not sit. He stood at the bridge for the entire run, 4 hours, 5 hours. He smoked one pipe to ash and lit another. He did not eat. He did not speak above a low murmur to his executive officer. Years later, the men who served under him would say that what they remembered more than anything else from that night was the quiet. The disciplined, unbroken, exhausted quiet of 5 destroyers moving at 31 knots into a fight that the Japanese did not know was coming. It was now 1 in the morning of November 25th, 1943. Thanksgiving Day in the United States. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Onami, 14 miles to the north, Captain Kyoto Kagawa was finishing his evacuation. His 5 destroyers had reached Buka after dark and loaded the last of the Japanese garrison aboard in less than 90 minutes. He was running ahead of schedule. He had begun his northwest run toward Rabaul shortly after midnight. His 3 transport destroyers, Amagiri, Yugiri, and Uzuki, were in column behind his 2 escorts. Kagawa did not have effective radar. The Japanese Navy had been developing radar throughout 1943, but the sets available on destroyers were inferior in range and reliability to the American SG. Onami carried a Type 22 surface search set, but it had been giving intermittent returns for hours. Kagawa was navigating as Japanese destroyer captains had always navigated, by chart, by compass, by lookout. His lookouts were among the best trained night observers in any navy in the world. On any clear night, with even a sliver of moon, they would have seen the American destroyers at 6,000 yards. This was not a clear night. The overcast had grown thicker. Visibility from his bridge wings was less than 3,000 yards in any direction. Kagawa was running blind, and he did not know he was running blind, because he had no instrument that could tell him so. There was one ship in his formation, however, with a small piece of history attached to her. She was the destroyer Amagiri. She was a Fubuki-class vessel, built in the early 1930s, painted grey, scarred along the bow. She was the 3rd ship in Kagawa's column, loaded that night with about 100 Japanese soldiers being taken out of Buka. 3 months and 23 days earlier, in the rainy small hours of August 2nd, 1943, the Amagiri had cut in half a small American patrol boat in Blackett Strait. The patrol boat was PT-109. Her commanding officer, 26 years old at the time, had survived. He was a Massachusetts lieutenant junior grade named John F. Kennedy. The ship that had nearly killed the future 35th President of the United States was now running north toward Arleigh Burke at 26 knots. She did not yet know it. Neither did Kagawa, neither did the men in her engine room, or her wardroom, or her radio shack. In the chart house of the USS Charles Osborne, 14 miles to the south, the green ring of the SG radar swept once across an empty screen. Then again. On the 3rd sweep, the operator went very still. He turned and looked at Burke. He did not have to say anything. The contact was there, 22,000 yards. Closing. Burke did not move. He had waited 20 years for this. He could wait 12 more minutes. He gave one quiet order to his exec, who relayed it to the helmsman. Charles Osborne, Dyson, and Claxton swung onto an intercept heading. The destroyers behind, Converse and Spence, fell back into reserve. Speed steady at 31 knots. The radar plot resolved. 5 Japanese contacts in a loose column, 2 leading, 3 trailing. The 2 leaders, Burke would learn later, were Onami and Makinami, Kagawa's escort destroyers. The 3 trailing were the transports. Amagiri, Yugiri, Uzuki, loaded with men. Burke aimed at the escorts, 15,000 yards, 12,000. The Japanese had no contact. Kagawa's lookouts saw nothing. Onama's faulty radar showed nothing. The 3 American destroyers slid through the dark at flank speed, hulls leaning hard to starboard as they turned to bring their starboard torpedo mounts into firing arc, 6,000 yards. Burke had ordered the firing range to be 5,500. Inside that, the math was simple. The Japanese could not turn in time. At 5,500 yards, at 1:55 in the morning of November the 25th, 1943, the 3 lead destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 23 fired their starboard torpedo mounts in unison. 15 Mark 15 torpedoes hit the water. They began to swim. In the bridge of Onami, Captain Kyoto Kagawa was leaning over a chart, ordering a course correction toward the New Ireland coastline. He did not see them coming. None of his lookouts did. The torpedoes ran for 3 minutes. Onami took at least 4 hits along her port side at almost the same instant. Her forward magazine ignited. The ship that had been the flagship of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron simply ceased to exist in the dark. More than 200 Japanese sailors went with her, including her captain. There was no signal, no transmission, no survivors picked up. Onami was at 26 knots 1 second and gone the next, and a column of black water rose where she had been and then collapsed. Makinami, behind her, took at least 1 hit at the stern. Her rudder jammed, her engines went. She began to drift in a slow circle, dead in the water, burning. The 3 transports behind, Amagiri, Yugiri, Uzuki, saw the explosions, heard them, felt the shock against their hulls through the water, and they turned. The 3 Japanese transports turned 90 degrees and ran northwest, away from the wreck of Onami, toward the cover of Rabaul, 200 miles ahead. Burke watched them go. He could not pursue all of them at once. He had to finish what was in front of him first. Converse and Spence, his reserve division, were now ordered up. Their job: kill Makinami. The 2 American destroyers closed. They opened fire with 5-inch guns. Makinami was already burning. She could not maneuver. She could not return fire effectively. Her crew did what destroyer crews do when the ship is finished, and the orders to abandon have not come. They worked the guns until they could not. They fired torpedoes at the muzzle flashes of the American destroyers. They missed. Converse and Spence poured 5-inch shells into Makinami until she rolled over and sank. Most of her crew died with her. Burke did not watch. He was already moving. He had 3 Japanese destroyers running northwest, and they had a head start. He took the squadron up to the most his fouled hulls could manage, and ran. The chase lasted more than 90 minutes. In the dark, on the open ocean, with no horizon and no visible reference, the only thing that connected the American destroyers to their fleeing prey was the green ring of the SG radar. Burke watched it. He watched the gap close. Yugiri, slowest of the 3 transports, was the easiest target. She was falling behind her own column. By 3:28 in the morning, Burke's destroyers had closed to inside 10,000 yards. Yugiri turned to fight. It was an act of professional honor. Her captain knew he could not outrun the Americans. He knew he carried hundreds of Japanese soldiers below decks who had nowhere to go. He chose to die facing the enemy rather than running. He turned his destroyer 90 degrees and brought his port guns into action. The Americans opened fire. Yugiri returned fire. For 3 or 4 minutes, in the dark, the 2 columns exchanged 5-inch shells across open water. A Japanese shell splashed close aboard the Charles Osborne. Another exploded short. But Burke had 3 ships to Yugiri's 1. He had radar fire control. He had every advantage that the night had ever given his enemy. Yugiri took repeated hits in her superstructure. Her bridge went silent. A fire bloomed from her funnel. She began to lose way. At 3:35 in the morning she rolled and sank. She took with her hundreds of men. Her crew, the Japanese soldiers being evacuated from Buka, the officers of her bridge. There were 2 destroyers still running, Amagiri and Uzuki. Northwest toward Rabaul, opening the range, holding their speed in the dark. Burke had them on radar. He had time, possibly, to catch one of them. He looked at the chart. It was now 4 in the morning. Dawn was 2 hours away. The Japanese were running into the cover of their own air force. Rabaul was less than 200 miles to the northwest. By 6:30, when light came up, Japanese aircraft would be over the water, in numbers, hunting whatever American ships were in range. Burke did the calculation in his head. If he pursued for another 30 minutes, he might catch Amagiri. If he caught her, the engagement might take another 20. By the time it was done, he would be inside Japanese air range with the sun behind him. He turned to his executive officer. "Break off pursuit, course 180. The order went out at 4:04 in the morning of November the 25th, 1943. Charles, Osborne, Dyson, Claxton, Converse, and Spence turned south, away from Rabaul, away from the Dawn, away from Amagiri. The destroyer Amagiri, in turn, kept running northwest into the dark, with about 100 Japanese troops aboard who had no idea how close they had just come to dying. It was the most important decision Burke made that night. A reconnaissance flight at first light confirmed what he had suspected. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul were forming up over their airfields as the sun rose. Had he pursued 30 minutes longer, they would have caught him. The Battle of Cape Saint. George ended at first light on Thanksgiving Day, 1943. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk: Onami, Makinami, Yugiri. Hundreds of Japanese sailors and soldiers dead in the South Pacific dark. 2 destroyers escaped, including the Amagiri. American losses: 0. No American ships lost. No American ships significantly damaged. No American sailor killed. 5 destroyers had engaged 5 Japanese destroyers, sunk 3 of them, and come home with their paint scratched but their hulls intact. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was not in the habit of overstatement, sent Burke a message that called the action a tactical masterpiece. Within a year, Cape Saint. George had become a teaching case at the Naval War College. It is still taught there today. Young surface warfare officers in the United States Navy in 2026 learn what Arleigh Burke did at 1:55 in the morning on November 25, 1943, the way they learn what Spruance did at Midway and what Halsey did at Leyte Gulf. But the men who fought it went on. 3.5 months later, in March of 1944, Captain Arleigh Burke was reassigned. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task forces of the Pacific Fleet, asked for him by name. Mitcher needed a chief of staff who understood surface combat, gunnery, and the new tactical realities of the war. Burke left Destroyer Squadron 23. He never commanded ships in surface combat again. For the remaining 17 months of the Pacific War, Burke flew aboard aircraft carriers instead of riding destroyers. He served Mitcher in the Marianas, in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima at Okinawa. On the 11th of May 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, 2 Japanese kamikaze pilots flew their aircraft into the carrier USS Bunkhill, Mitcher's flagship. Almost 400 American sailors died. Burke survived. He helped evacuate the wounded and transfer the staff to a new flagship. 3 days later, on the new flagship USS Enterprise, another kamikaze hit. He survived that one, too. When the war ended in August of 1945, Arleigh Burke was 43 years old. He had been in combat for less than 3 years out of 22 in the Navy. It was enough. He came home. He took staff and command assignments. He went to the Korean War as part of the United Nations truce negotiating team, sitting across the table from North Korean and Chinese officers in a long cold tent at Panmunjom. And in Korea, he met the Japanese again, not as enemies, as potential allies. The United States by 1950 had begun to understand that an unarmed Japan was a liability in the Cold War. Tokyo needed a maritime force again, a coast guard, eventually a navy. In the early 1950s, the Pentagon turned to officers who knew the Japanese, respected them, and could speak with them on equal terms. They turned to Arleigh Burke. Through 1952 and the years that followed, Burke worked with a former Imperial Japanese Navy admiral named Kichisaburo Nomura, who had been the Japanese ambassador to Washington at the time of Pearl Harbor. The two of them, the American who had killed more Japanese destroyer crews than any officer in the war, and the Japanese diplomat who had failed to prevent the war, sat across the same conference tables. They built, between them, the framework for what would become the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, the new Japanese Navy, born in 1954, trained by Americans, equipped at first with American hulls. The man who had emptied Onami of every soul aboard helped restore to Japan the right to put hulls in the water at all. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force has honored Arleigh Burke ever since. They placed his portrait at their headquarters in Tokyo. They invited his widow to their events for years after he died. A history of irony, a history of war that does not end the way we are usually told it ends. In August of 1955, President Dwight Eisenhower appointed Arleigh Burke as Chief of Naval Operations. He was reappointed twice. He served 6 years in the position, longer than any other man in the history of the United States Navy. He shaped the nuclear fleet. He pushed through the Polaris submarine program, the missile boats that gave the United States the ability to retaliate from beneath the sea. He retired in 1961. He was 59 years old. He lived another 35 years in Fairfax, Virginia, in a quiet brick house with Bobby. He smoked his pipe. He gave occasional speeches. He answered letters from young officers. On the 16th of September 1989, the United States Navy launched a new destroyer at the Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine. She was the first of her class. The Navy had named the class in his honor. Bobby Burke, 88 years old, walked up to the bow of the ship and broke a bottle of champagne against the steel. The hull slid down the launching ways into the cold Atlantic. 2 years later, on the 4th of July 1991, the USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, was commissioned at Norfolk, Virginia. Burke was 89, frail, standing. He gave a short speech. "This ship is built to fight, you had better know how." That was the line. That was almost all of it. He died less than 5 years later, on the 1st of January 1996. He was 94. Bobby followed him in October of 1997. There are now more than 70 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in commission with the United States Navy. They patrol every ocean. They are the most numerous class of large surface combatants in any navy in the world. They are still being built. Each one carries the same name. Each one carries the same painted phrase somewhere on the bridge in honor of the men who first wore it, the Little Beavers of Destroyer Squadron 23. But the story of the man, the actual man, the farm boy from Boulder, the desk-bound ordnance specialist who was 41 before he heard a shot fired at him in anger, the captain who took 5 destroyers into the dark on Thanksgiving night, 1943, and brought all 5 of them home. That story has begun to fade. It is fading even now. In the chart house of a destroyer somewhere, on patrol tonight, the green ring of an SG radar still sweeps across a black screen. 22,000 yards, closing.